Hey everyone, and welcome back to rawCast. I'm Artie, and well, let's just say today's topic isn't exactly sunshine and rainbows.
I'm Allie, and yeah, you're not wrong. We're going to be talking about whether 2025 is shaping up to be, well, the worst year ever.
We're not saying it definitely will be,
Yeah.
but there are some pretty unsettling trends out there.
Exactly. Things that we really need to unpack. We're talking about excess deaths, a mental health crisis, and then you've got societal division and the looming impact of AI, just to name a few.
So buckle up, listeners, because we're about to dive into some potentially bleak but really important information.
Yeah, for sure. First up, let's talk about life expectancy. You'd think in a developed country like the U.S., life expectancy would be steadily increasing.
Yeah, you'd assume that.
But the reality is, the U.S. is one of the few countries where it's actually going down.
Really?
Yeah. An NIH study showed that between 2020 and 2022, life expectancy for men dropped by 1.8 years down to 74.5 years.
Wow.
For women, the drop was 1.2 years, down to 80.2 years.
That's a pretty significant decrease.
It is.
What's even more alarming is that this downward trend didn't just stop with the pandemic.
Right.
While things were returning to some semblance of normal in other parts of the world, U.S. life expectancy continued to decline.
Exactly. So what's going on here?
Yeah. Why is this happening?
Well, one major factor is this really unsettling rise in deaths of despair.
Okay, so deaths of despair. That's a pretty heavy term. What exactly does that encompass?
Yeah, it refers to deaths caused by things like suicide drug overdoses and alcohol-related liver disease. It's basically a measure of how much hopelessness and lack of purpose is out there, especially among certain groups.
And I'm guessing, based on how you're describing this, that these deaths of despair aren't exactly a small issue.
You're right, they're not. In 2021 alone, over 209,000 people in the U.S. died from deaths of despair, making up about 6% of all deaths.
Wow.
That's the highest it's ever been. To give you some context, back in 1995, the number was only 65,000.
So it's more than tripled in just a couple of decades.
It has. And here's another really sobering fact. Over the past decade, deaths of despair, particularly those related to alcohol, have actually surpassed COVID-19 deaths in the U.S.
That's a pretty shocking statistic.
It really is. And it's crucial to point out that this trend is hitting working-class men between the ages of 15 and 55 especially hard.
I see.
A University of Chicago report found that at the start of the pandemic, deaths of despair in this demographic surged by anywhere from 10% to a staggering 60% compared to pre-pandemic levels.
That's a massive increase. It really makes you wonder why so many people, especially men, are feeling so hopeless that they're choosing death over life.
Yeah. There are a lot of potential contributing factors, but one that's been getting a lot of attention is this idea of a crisis of masculinity.
So what does that actually mean?
Well, it's about this feeling of purposelessness and isolation that a lot of young men seem to be experiencing. They're struggling to find their place in a world that's rapidly changing around them.
And this isn't just some abstract concept. This crisis seems to be playing out in some pretty alarming statistics on self-harm.
Absolutely. Between 2001 and 2021, the rate of self-harm deaths in the U.S. went up a whopping 31%. By 2022, it had reached over 39,200 men and nearly 10,200 women.
That's actually the highest rate since 1941, according to the CDC.
Right.
And it's not just men we need to be concerned about. The increase in self-harm among young girls is really troubling, too.
Yeah, it is. A study showed that between 2009 and 2022, there was a dramatic increase in emergency room admissions for self-harm among girls between 10 and 14 years old.
Wow.
And it's not just an American problem. We're seeing similar trends in other countries like England, Scotland, and Australia.
So it's really a global issue. What's fueling this epidemic of self-harm and despair, especially among young people?
Well, it's a complicated issue, but social media definitely seems to be playing a role.
That's something the U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy has been quite outspoken about.
He has.
He's even called for social media platforms to have warnings similar to those on cigarette packs because of the role they seem to be playing in the huge increase in anxiety and depression among young people.
Exactly. And for a lot of young girls, that feeling of inadequacy can be especially triggered by the constant stream of perfect lives they're seeing online. It's setting this impossible standard that can have really serious consequences for their mental health.
And there's also a lot of conversation about how the traditional idea of what it means to be a man is being challenged and how that might be impacting young men.
Absolutely. In 2023, The New Yorker published an article that described men as floundering at school and in the workplace.
Right.
And that sparked a lot of discussion online about how the roles of men are changing in society and what that means for their self-esteem.
Yeah.
There's also research suggesting that the way men are portrayed in the media is contributing to this issue. A study that analyzed U.S. sitcoms from 1980 to 2017 found that portrayals of dads as incompetent skyrocketed from 18% in the 80s to 56% in the 2010s.
So it seems like there's a lot of confusion and frustration among young men about what it means to be a man in today's world.
Yeah, there is. And unfortunately, it looks like this crisis of masculinity isn't going away anytime soon. It's a complex issue with deep roots, and finding solutions will require a lot of open and honest conversations about what it means to be a man in the 21st century.
Now let's add another layer to this whole mental health crisis, the opioid epidemic.
Right. This isn't exactly new, but it's definitely gotten worse in recent years. The U.S. is currently in the fourth wave of this crisis, and it's important to understand how we got here.
Yeah, I think a lot of people might not be familiar with the different waves of this epidemic. Can you break that down for us?
Sure, it all started with the overprescription of opioid drugs by Big Pharma, which wasn't adequately regulated by politicians and federal agencies. That was the first wave.
And then when those prescriptions ran out, a lot of people who had become addicted turned to heroin. That was the second wave.
Right. Then came the third wave with the introduction of synthetic opioids like fentanyl, which are even more potent and dangerous.
And now we're in the fourth wave, where these synthetic opioids, especially fentanyl, are being increasingly mixed into other drugs like cocaine and meth, making them even deadlier.
Yeah, and the thing is, the people making and trafficking these drugs are getting more and more sophisticated, making them even more dangerous.
It's a really scary trend. Can you give us some idea of how much this problem has escalated over the years?
Well, back in the 70s and 80s, during Nixon's war on drugs, overdose deaths were somewhere between 2,500 and 7,000 per year.
Okay.
But fast forward to 2023, and we saw over 107,500 deaths from overdoses.
Wow.
And that's after 111,000 deaths in 2022.
It's an absolutely staggering increase.
It really is. It shows that the war on drugs hasn't been effective, and sadly, this opioid crisis will likely continue to be a major issue in 2025.
So we've got this crisis of masculinity, the pressures of social media, and the opioid epidemic. What else is adding to this sense of unease and the decline in mental health?
Well, political polarization is another significant factor. It's been building for years, but it feels like things have reached a boiling point lately.
Yeah, a Pew Research survey found that 65% of Americans feel exhausted and 55% feel angry when they talk about politics.
Right.
Another survey even found that 87% are just plain exhausted by all the division.
It's true. This toxic polarization, as it's being called, is taking a real toll on people's mental well-being. And research suggests that the media might be playing a role in this division.
There was a 2023 study where researchers at the University of Rochester used machine learning AI to analyze almost 2 million headlines from mainstream media outlets.
Yeah.
Their findings were pretty concerning.
Yeah, they found evidence of growing media bias, which they believe is contributing to this polarization.
They said that even though the differences in the wording might seem small when the same topic is covered by different outlets, those small differences can have a big impact on how people perceive those issues.
Right. It shapes their understanding and ultimately contributes to the division we're seeing.
Stanford University also did some research on this and found that even subtle differences in how information is presented in the media can influence people's understanding.
So it's not just about what's being reported, but how it's being reported that's feeding into this problem.
And all of this ties into another concerning trend: declining trust in media. Gallup found that trust in the media is at an all-time low, with only 31% of Americans saying they have a great deal or fair amount of confidence in the media to report the news accurately and fairly.
And this distrust goes beyond just feeling like the media is biased. A 2023 poll showed that half of Americans believe that their national news organizations are intentionally trying to mislead, misinform, or persuade the public to adopt certain viewpoints.
So it's not just about bias, it's about feeling like there's an agenda at play.
Exactly. And this decline in trust goes beyond just the media. We're seeing a decline in trust in institutions across the board, including the government.
This lack of trust, combined with the increasing political polarization and the breakdown of social connections, paints a pretty grim picture of American society right now.
It definitely raises concerns about our ability to come together and address the complex challenges we're facing, not just in 2025, but in the years to come.
And if all of that wasn't enough, there's another troubling trend on the horizon: a potential decline in cognitive abilities.
This is what researchers are calling the reverse Flynn effect.
Okay, so to understand that, we first need to understand the original Flynn effect.
Right. The Flynn effect refers to the trend of rising IQ scores over time. Basically, each generation was scoring higher on intelligence tests than the one before.
Got it.
But now we're seeing that trend reverse for the first time in decades. IQ scores are actually starting to go down in some countries, including the UK and the US.
Really?
Yeah. And while the exact reasons for this decline aren't fully understood, some experts think it could be related to our growing reliance on technology and the way it's changing how our brains process information.
It's interesting that this decline is happening even though we have better education, better nutrition, and access to more information than ever before.
Exactly. It raises some serious questions about the long-term impact of all this screen time.
Gallup has also reported that Americans are reading fewer books than ever.
Right. In 2021, a Pew Research study found that 23% of Americans hadn't read a single book in the entire previous year, and that includes audiobooks.
Wow.
Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt has been doing a lot of research on this topic, and he believes that this potential decline in cognitive abilities is literally rewiring our brains. He argues that it's contributing to more polarization, anxiety, depression, and a general decline in critical thinking skills.
He's even gone so far as to say that we could be headed for civilizational collapse because of this.
While that might be a bit dramatic, it does highlight just how serious this issue is. If we're not careful, our increasing reliance on technology and the constant flood of information could end up undermining our ability to think critically and have meaningful conversations with each other.
That's a pretty scary thought.
It is, but before we completely descend into despair, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something a little lighter. The possibility of war.
Okay, so from a potential mental decline to global conflict, I guess no conversation about the worst year ever would be complete without discussing the possibility of war.
Unfortunately, you're right. We've seen a lot of conflict and instability around the world in recent years. And while we all hope for peace, it's likely that tensions will remain high in 2025.
So where do you things stand right now when it comes to global conflict?
Well, political scientist John Mearsheimer has warned that relations between the U.S., its allies, and rival nations are going to stay pretty volatile.
And a big part of that tension has to do with China's rise as a global power.
Right.
It's challenging the U.S.'s dominance, which it's held for so long.
Exactly. And the U.S. has been pushing back with things like the trade war, which has just made the relationship even more strained.
Now, most experts don't think we're heading for an all-out war between the U.S. and China in 2025.
Right. But that doesn't mean everything is fine. This competition between these two superpowers is playing out in other ways, like in economics and technology, which could still really destabilize things globally.
And then you have someone like George F. Will, a foreign affairs writer for the Washington Post, who's actually arguing that World War III has already started. That's a pretty intense claim.
It is. He's pointing to this emerging alliance between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, which he calls the New Axis.
Oh, wow.
He argues that this alliance, combined with the U.S.'s strong support for Israel, which could drag Iran into a conflict, has basically created the conditions for a global war.
And we're seeing reports that the U.S. is already preparing for a potential conflict with Iran.
So a full-scale world war might not be on the schedule for 2025, but it definitely feels like the world is on edge, like something big could happen.
And the public seems to be picking up on that.
They are. One poll found that 22% of Americans think World War III will happen within the next decade. And in the UK, a YouGov survey found that a whopping 53% believe a global war is likely within the next 5 to 10 years.
Those are some pretty significant numbers. To understand this potential for conflict, it's helpful to think about it through the lens of something called political realism.
Okay.
I'll admit, I'm not a political science expert. What is political realism?
Basically, it's a theory that emphasizes how important power is in international relations. Because there's no real global authority, countries are always trying to gain power and security, even if it means other countries lose out. This creates an environment where there's very little trust and everyone is trying to get ahead, which can obviously lead to conflict.
So it's kind of like a survival of the fittest situation on the world stage.
That's a good way to put it. Mearsheimer, the political scientist we mentioned earlier, calls this the tragedy of great power politics. Even if countries don't actually want war, the way the international system is set up can make conflict almost unavoidable.
So it's not necessarily about evil intentions, but more about how the system itself encourages competition and mistrust.
Exactly. And then you add in the massive amounts of money countries spend on their militaries. We're talking trillions of dollars globally. The U.S. alone spends over $1 trillion on national security.
That just creates this cycle where countries feel insecure, so they spend more on their military, which makes other countries feel even more insecure, and so on. It's like a never-ending arms race.
It really is.
Right.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about another crisis that's been brewing. the loneliness epidemic.
This might not seem as urgent as a potential world war, but loneliness has a huge impact on people and society as a whole.
Absolutely. And it's not just about feeling sad or isolated. Loneliness has been linked to serious health problems like heart disease, depression, and even a shorter lifespan.
What's really concerning is that this loneliness epidemic is happening among Gen Z, the generation that's supposed to be the most connected.
It's a weird paradox. They're online all the time, yet they report feeling lonelier than any other generation. And research is backing this up. Studies show that Gen Z is having fewer romantic partners and less sex than any generation before them.
Huh.
The American Survey Center found that almost half of young men aren't even dating.
Wow.
And a study by the Survey Center on American Life found that only 56% of Gen Z adults were in a romantic relationship as teenagers, compared to 78% of baby boomers and 76% of Gen Xers.
That's a big difference.
And while this trend seems to be especially pronounced among young men, young women are also dating less. A 2021 study in California found that 38% of both men and women aged 18 to 30 hadn't had a sexual partner in the previous year.
So this isn't just a guy problem. It's impacting everyone.
Exactly. And this decline in romantic relationships is having a real impact on mental health. Experts believe it's contributing to the isolation, depression, and anxiety that so many young people are struggling with.
And as technology keeps advancing and we spend even more time in the digital world, it's likely this loneliness epidemic will only get worse.
And that's where some tech companies are coming in with a solution that's a little, well, dystopian. They're talking about AI companionship.
So basically replacing real human connection with virtual robots.
Pretty much. The idea is that these AI-powered chatbots and virtual assistants can provide a sense of companionship and help people feel less lonely.
But isn't that just covering up the problem instead of actually fixing it?
That's what a lot of experts are worried about. AI companionship might offer a temporary distraction, but it can't truly replace real human connection.
Even ChatGPT, the AI chatbot developed by OpenAI, recognizes this.
It does.
When asked about AI replacing human connection, it said, it cannot replace the complexity and richness of human connection.
So even AI itself knows it can't fill that void.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? We're turning to technology to solve a problem that technology helped create.
It really is. It highlights how important it is to find ways to nurture genuine human connection in a world that's increasingly digital.
Okay, speaking of technology, let's talk about another challenge on the horizon: the rise of AI and its potential impact on the workforce.
This is a big one. The World Economic Forum predicts that by 2025, AI will displace 85 million jobs globally.
85 million, that's a huge number of people potentially losing their jobs.
It is. And while they also predict that AI will create 97 million new jobs in that same time frame, we don't really know what those jobs will look like or who will be qualified for them.
And will companies be willing to retrain workers for these new roles? That's a big question mark.
Exactly. If they don't, we could see a massive increase in unemployment and economic inequality.
This isn't just some hypothetical scenario either. The Guardian reported that AI could potentially eliminate 8 million jobs in the UK alone. And the IMF predicts that AI will affect 40% of all jobs globally, which could make existing inequalities even worse.
This is a serious issue, and it's one that policymakers and business leaders need to be proactive about addressing.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from mental health and political polarization to the potential for global conflict and job displacement by AI. What does all of this mean for our physical health as we head into 2025?
This might sound surprising, but the data suggests we're in a growing health crisis, and it's not just about the pandemic or some new disease emerging. It's about a combination of factors that are leading to a decline in our overall health and well-being.
So it's a bigger, more systemic issue than just a single virus or disease.
Exactly. A peer-reviewed article in the British Medical Journal analyzed mortality data from our world in data, and their findings are pretty disturbing.
Okay, what do they find?
They found that from January 1st, 2020 to December 31st, 2022, there were over 3 million excess deaths in 47 Western countries.
So these excess deaths are basically the number of deaths above and beyond what we normally expect based on historical trends.
Right.
What's particularly concerning is that these excess deaths remained high even after pandemic measures were lifted and vaccines were widely available.
Right. They found about 1 million excess deaths in 2020, 1.2 million in 2021, and 800,000 in 2022.
And this trend of elevated excess deaths has continued into 2024 in places like the US, the UK, much of Europe and Australia.
Clearly, there's something going on here that goes beyond the pandemic.
Yeah.
And is contributing to this increase in mortality.
Another piece of this puzzle is the increase in early onset cancers.
Right. The BBC cited a study that found a 79% increase in the global incidence of early-onset cancer between 1990 and 2019. And during that same period, cancer-related deaths in younger people went up by 29%.
Those are alarming statistics.
They really are. Experts are still trying to understand what's behind this increase, but some believe it could be related to rising obesity rates and other environmental factors.
And speaking of obesity, that's another huge health crisis that's only getting worse.
The World Health Organization estimates that 1 in 8 people worldwide is obese. And here in the U.S., the CDC estimates that 40% of adults and 1 in 5 children are obese.
Those numbers are really concerning.
And they're projected to keep going up. A 2023 Lancet study predicted that by 2050, 2 out of 3 American adults will be obese, along with 1 out of 3 teenagers and 1 out of 5 children.
So obesity is on track to become even more widespread than it is now.
Yeah.
What's driving this epidemic?
One major factor is the prevalence of ultra-processed foods in our diets.
Can you explain what you mean by ultra-processed foods?
Sure. These are foods that are made mostly from substances extracted from foods like fats, starches, sugars, and proteins rather than from whole foods themselves. They often contain artificial flavors, colors, and preservatives, and they're designed to be highly palatable and addictive. Think things like packaged snacks, sugary drinks, fast food, and pre-prepared meals.
So basically a lot of the convenient, ready-to-eat foods that many people rely on.
Exactly. And Harvard Public Health has identified these ultra-processed foods, or UPFs, as a major culprit in the obesity epidemic and a key driver of this overall health crisis we're talking about.
And just how much of these UPFs are people eating?
It's estimated that UPFs make up anywhere from 60% to 90% of the standard American diet.
Wow.
In the UK, it's slightly lower, with UPFs accounting for 57% of calories consumed by the average adult and 65% of the average child's diet.
So no matter how you slice it, it seems like we're consuming way too much of this stuff.
Yeah.
What are the consequences of eating so much ultra-processed food?
The consequences are pretty serious. A paper in the British Medical Journal linked UPFs to at least 32 diseases. We're talking heart disease, cancer, lung conditions, mental health disorders, and a whole range of other health problems.
It's almost like we're slowly poisoning ourselves with the food we're eating.
That's a good way to put it. And it's not just impacting our health, it's costing us a fortune. From 2011 to 2020, nutrition-related chronic diseases cost the U.S. a staggering $16 trillion.
So this isn't just a personal health crisis, it's an economic one too.
It is. And meanwhile, the food and pharmaceutical industries are making huge profits. It's this vicious cycle where we're being sold unhealthy food, we get sick, and then we need expensive medications to manage those illnesses.
And it seems like we're becoming more and more reliant on medication.
It's true. Over half of all Americans take prescription drugs daily, often, for health problems that are directly linked to their diet.
Really?
In fact, 70% of Americans take at least one prescription medication per day, up from 60% just 9 years ago.
And 1 in 6 Americans is taking a psychiatric drug, often for conditions that could be significantly improved with a healthier diet and lifestyle changes.
It's true. Then there's the alarming rise in diabetes. The CDC reports that the rate of diagnosed diabetes in the U.S. has skyrocketed from just under 1% in 1958 to about 11% in 2021.
Wow.
And it's projected to reach around 14% by 2023 and continue to climb in the years beyond.
And the situation is just as worrying globally. 529 million people were living with diabetes in 2021, and that number is expected to reach a staggering 1.3 billion by 2050.
It's a global epidemic with devastating consequences.
So it seems pretty obvious that the solution is to simply eat better.
In theory, yes. But in reality, it's not that simple. Healthy food is often more expensive. And with the cost of living continuing to rise, it's getting harder and harder for people to afford nutritious food.
Research in the UK has shown that people in the poorest areas are actually living shorter lives now than they did 20 years ago. And in the U.S., the richest Americans live on average 15 years longer than the poorest.
This really highlights the stark inequality in health outcomes that are directly linked to socioeconomic factors.
So we're not just talking about individual choices, we're talking about systemic issues that are impacting people's access to healthy food and healthcare.
Exactly. And this is where the conversation needs to shift. We need to start talking about how to make healthy food more accessible and affordable for everyone, not just those who can afford it.
So this isn't just about telling people to eat their vegetables. It's about creating a system that supports healthy choices for everyone.
Exactly. It's about addressing those underlying socioeconomic factors that are contributing to this health crisis.
It feels like we've covered a whole lot of doom and gloom here. Is there any reason to be optimistic about the future?
Well, it's important to remember that even though these trends are concerning, they're not inevitable. We have the power to make choices both individually and as a society that can help us navigate these challenges and create a better future.
So it's not a foregone conclusion that 2025 will be a complete disaster.
Definitely not. But it does require us to be aware of these issues and take action. Individually, we can focus on making healthier choices for ourselves and our families, and collectively, we need to push for policies that address these systemic problems, like making healthy food more accessible and affordable.
So what can people do to be more proactive about their own health and well-being, especially with all these factors working against them?
Well, knowledge is power. The more you understand about these issues, the better equipped you'll be to make informed decisions. It's about being aware of the risks, but also about understanding the potential solutions.
So it's about staying informed and not just burying our heads in the sand.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual action, it's about collective action. We need to be engaged citizens, holding our leaders accountable and demanding better from the systems that are failing us.
So it's about using our voices and our votes to push for change.
Absolutely. And remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, effort, and a lot of persistence. But it's possible. We've overcome challenges in the past, and we can do it again.
So what are some specific things listeners can do to be more engaged and proactive?
Well, you can start by supporting organizations that are working to address these issues. There are groups out there fighting for food justice, promoting mental health awareness, and advocating for policies that promote well-being.
And I imagine getting involved in local politics can be a powerful way to make a difference.
Absolutely. Attending town hall meetings, contacting your elected officials, and voting in local elections can have a real impact on the decisions that are made in your community.
So it's about being informed, getting involved, and using our voices to push for change.
Exactly. And it's also about taking care of ourselves. In the face of all this negativity, it's easy to get overwhelmed and feel hopeless. But it's important to remember that self-care isn't selfish. It's essential.
So what are some ways people can practice self-care in these potentially stressful times?
Well, there are lots of things you can do. Spend time in nature, connect with loved ones, engage in activities that bring you joy, and make sure you're getting enough sleep and exercise.
It's about taking care of our mental and physical health so we have the energy and resilience to face these challenges.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone in this. Millions of people are feeling the same anxieties and concerns. Connect with others, share your thoughts and feelings, and support each other.
So even though we've painted a pretty bleak picture of what 2025 might hold, there's still hope.
There absolutely is. We have a choice to make. We can either give in to fear and despair, or we can choose to face these challenges with courage, determination, and a belief in our ability to create a better world.
It's about choosing hope over fear and action over apathy.
Exactly. And remember, even small actions can have a ripple effect. Every choice we make, every action we take can contribute to a more positive future.
So to our listeners out there, don't underestimate the power you have to make a difference.
That's right. Your choices matter, your voice matters, and your actions matter. So get informed, get involved, and get active in creating the future you want to see.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. It's been a heavy but important conversation.
It has. And we hope it's given you some food for thought and inspired you to take action.
Thanks for tuning into rawCast. We'll be back soon with more interesting chats.